Jenesa is a policy analyst at the New Zealand initiative, where she focuses on social and lifestyle regulations. She is the author of the report The Health of the State, which looks at evidence and ideology behind public health and lifestyle regulations. We've got Gary Johns. He is an adjunct professor at QUT. He's a columnist for the Australian newspaper. He served in the House of Reps and in the Keating governments. He was an associate commissioner of the Commonwealth Productivity Commission. We've also got Joe Costeridge. He's a Perth-based author, speaker, doctor and health industry consultant. He's got a column in the Medical Republic. He's an assistant clinical editor at the Medical Forum, and he's regularly on the Channel 9 and radio. He's previously held senior positions in the Australian Medical Association, and he sat on numerous industry and government boards. Finally, we have Terry Barnes. He's worked for 20 years in both politics and bureaucracy, and he was a senior policy and political advisor to two health ministers. In the public service, Terry was a senior officer in several federal portfolios, including health, education and immigration. First up, I'll take you over to Janesa.
Right, well, my name's Jenesa. I'm from the New Zealand Initiative, which is a public policy think tank based in New Zealand. So I know I won't be blowing anyone's minds here today by saying that the government should generally stop telling us what to do with our own bodies. They should stop telling us to give up the things that give us pleasure. But what I wanted to talk about today is the evidence, or lack thereof, behind these regulations. I'm worried that currently public health experts calling for more regulations seem to be winning the conversation about evidence. They're winning the conversation about evidence because they're pretty much the only ones in it. That's frustrating because actually, am I not Yep, sorry, I'm very short. It's frustrating that they're winning the conversation about evidence because actually, a lot of the public health studies that are used to justify the regulations span from unconvincing to just plain terrible. Even more worrying, the people who are smart enough to be able to tell when public health studies are bad are normally those who shy away from the political and media spotlight. So, I'm here today to give some libertarians some useful tools for scrutinising public health studies. In some cases, the study is just of terrible quality. In other cases, the study might be fine, but the study's policy conclusions aren't actually justified. So you have a completely fine study, but then you get policy conclusions at the end that don't actually match up at all. So before we get started though, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself to give you a bit of background. The most important thing you need to know about me is that I'm not that smart. I mean, I'm not stupid either, but what I'm trying to say here is I'm not claiming any kind of special skill or knowledge. This isn't something that you need a PhD for. I think the basic skills you need to interpret public health studies is a dose of common sense, so general common sense, and time. You actually need time to download these public health studies, to actually read them, and a lot of people don't do that. You need time to not just rely on press releases and media reports. So I'm going to focus mainly on sugar taxes today because it's particularly timely. And I'll touch a little bit on vaping too, just because New Zealand has just legalised nicotine e-cigarettes. I know it's a battle that Australia seems to be going uphill with at the moment, so I don't want to rub it in your face, but I will point out when pointing to the evidence actually works. But really, the bigger lesson here is that it really pays not to take media reports at face value. Do take the time to read these kinds of things. And because we're crunched for time, if you are interested in this stuff, I have written a report on the subject, and I highly recommend that you download it from the New Zealand Initiative's website. So, So you probably can't tell from meeting the New Zealanders at this conference, but we in New Zealand are getting pretty fat. And in case nobody's told you, but Australia's getting pretty fat too. And sugar taxes do seem to be the trendiest policy to kind of address these obesity issues. The concerning thing is, international popularity hasn't grown with the evidence base. It's a policy that has grown, especially within public health circles and with public health experts, but the evidence base remains very thin on the ground. It's clear in some jurisdictions that it really is just a policy to raise revenue. So, what do we need to do to show that the emperor has no clothes? When it comes to controversial policy debates, you're going to have to slaughter some sacred cows. And when it comes to public health, we do have a lead cow, and that's the World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization has released a report claiming that there's overwhelming evidence that a sugar tax will work. The report has been used by public health groups the world over to justify a sugar tax in their own countries. The problem is that for those who bothered to read the report, and again, this is so important, I'm not smart, I just happen to be able to download things and read things on the internet, it's pretty underwhelming and probably wouldn't even pass first year uni standards. So here comes the first lesson. Always read the references. The first thing to note about the WHO paper is just how few citations it has. When the WHO claim that there's evidence that a sugar tax will work, what it really means is that a lot of countries have introduced one. I feel like I'm stating the obvious here, but that's not the same as proving that a sugar tax will reduce obesity. So even more mind-boggling is the inception-like referencing that the WHO adopts for its biggest claims. So it's hard to put into words exactly what it's doing, so I'll refer you to the slide here. Basically, the WHO claimed that there's evidence that sugar taxes will work when they're around 20 to 50%. But it cites a draft version of its own paper to make the point. Now, citing your own work is fine. I mean, it's academic masturbation, but we all do it sometimes. It's nice. Citing a publicly unavailable working draft of the same report, though, is pushing it. And citing a study, which looks at a study of a number of studies, is bordering on obfuscation, I'm thinking. So that's what the WHO has done, and they have been called out for that lack of transparency, but at the moment, this is the best evidence that they have. So following the rabbit warren of references and systematic reviews can be rewarding in itself. There are a lot of meta-studies that mix quality evidence with bad, and it skews that final conclusion. And I'm using the WHO as an example because a lot of people still believe that its status makes it credible. That lack of transparency at such a high level should raise alarm bells about the burden of proof required for these lifestyle regulations. I mean, this is the top, basically. This is as credible as it gets. So, one of the other frustrating things about public health experts arguing for a sugar tax is when they abuse basic economic principles to make their point. Advocates for a sugar tax love pointing out that it's basic economics, that when the price of a good goes up, consumption goes down. Now, you don't need a PhD in economics to know that that's what happens, and no one's denying that general principle. Price goes up, consumption goes down. But economics will also tell us that the magnitude of the tax matters. Small increases in price might have negligible effects on purchasing behaviour. For a sugar tax to have the same effect as, say, tobacco taxes, the magnitude has to be really, really high, much higher than the 20% most advocated for in New Zealand and Australia. And there actually has to be very few substitutes for it, so that the tax needs to be broad enough to cover all possibilities. A comprehensive junk food tax could work in that regard, but then it gets very difficult to implement in practice. So for sugar taxes to have the same effect as tobacco taxes, needs to be really large and cover all possible substitutes. And when you do that, it becomes really politically unfeasible. So I say there's very little real-world evidence that a sugar tax will work. And in this context, economic modelling can act as a second-best alternative. But economic models are only as strong and reliable as the assumptions they make. The lesson here is to look at the assumptions of the economic model. Just because it's called an economic model and it sounds kind of convincing and credible doesn't automatically mean that it's as strong as any of the other studies out there. We need to be looking at the assumptions of the model and the effects they're actually tracking. So the problem is that some models don't accurately factor into account the fact that when the price of one product goes up, people can switch to untaxed but equally unhealthy foods. Switching from Cokes to Frappuccinos should not be a public health win, but it is according to a lot of these studies. The models might also look at goals such as how taxes affect how much people spend on the product or the quantity that they buy, but not whether the taxes actually reduce obesity or the total calories consumed. And on that note, there is some exciting work coming out of New Zealand that turns on its head many of the assumptions made about sugar taxes out there at the moment. So most economic modelling to date only assumes that when the price of a good goes up, people spend less on that product. What it doesn't look at is whether people are switching to cheaper brands. This seems obvious, again, like you don't need to be an economist to figure out that this probably matters when you're looking at economic models, but it's something that public health experts haven't done to date. So to put it another way, some economic models will declare sugar taxes a success if people spend less on the product because they're buying budget brands rather than Coca-Cola. So Professor John Gibson from New Zealand's University of Waikato has done unique work looking at the consumer's ability to downshift to cheaper brands. Unlike other models, he looks at how people change their purchasing behaviour by looking at the quantity as well as the quality of the taxed product. I don't know about Australia, but in New Zealand, our public health experts love talking about Mexico at the moment as an example that there is promise in a sugar tax. But looking at Mexico, Gibson finds that once the quality of soda products are considered in the model, the expected weight reductions are about 0.5 kgs. That's not enough to have any real effect on obesity. I mean, 0.5 kgs is the difference between day and night for most people. So the existing literature on sugar taxes appears to be exaggerating the consumer's responsiveness by threefold or more. So finally, it's not just the economists that can see that sugar taxes aren't likely to be effective. Scientists have the same scepticism. In fact, in recent conversations with scientists specialising in genetics and biology, there's a real frustration that their public health colleagues simply are ignoring the evidence in science. So the difference between biologists and public health experts is the extent to which they believe that regulations affecting personal choice will translate into reductions in obesity. If obesity is genetic, then a sugar tax is an incredibly punitive measure. One already has a predisposition to overeat and consume more calories than your average person, and in fact, like anyone who is starving, their biological instinct is to satisfy their calorie cravings. Now, I'm not arguing a case of biological determinism here. You do have control over your own bodies, but I'm simply pointing out that sugar taxes are a population-wide measure. Yet the population that it's meant to help, the obese and those who are at risk of obesity, are least likely to respond by reducing the total calories that they consume. So regulations trying to affect only lifestyle ignore that this is not just a psychological problem. It's very much a physical and biological one. So now for some notes on vaping, just because I'm really proud of our government and the pragmatic response that we've had to it. I really do hope that Australia gets there soon in legalising the nicotine e-liquids. But it really is an example of not letting bad evidence distract from what is actually just common sense policy. and conversations with New Zealand policymakers. And it's the awesome thing about working at a think tank, you do have access to the people making the decisions. We did talk to people from the Ministry of Health. On the other hand, it became clear that a lot of people just weren't understanding the science and the risks. There are studies coming out nearly every week and they seem to contradict each other. So there was a lot of potential for scaremongering and letting loud voices within that public health community dominate the debate. They really did need, facts from the other side, and people who are willing to download the studies and point out what's wrong with these studies. They really did need that extra assistance. So the other reason why I'm bringing up vaping is because it's an example where the quality of evidence matters. To date, those studies claiming that there are undue and disproportionate risks are actually of very low quality. And so if no one else is doing it, I highly recommend that there are louder voices out there calling out bad studies when they do exist. But with vaping, a more disturbing occurrence has also been the shift in the burden of proof. So in New Zealand, we regulate nicotine e-liquids as a consumer product, and that's a really, really good thing. Vapers are the greatest testament that e-cigarettes have the potential to save lives, but policymakers don't actually have to wait for the proof of cessation properties, and that is what can hold up the debate, I guess. In New Zealand, because they're not treated as a therapeutic product, as long as there are no undue and disproportionate risks, the debate around its therapeutic properties is actually a bit of a distraction. I mean, as long as it's not going to blow up or contain heaps of poisons that are disproportionate to cigarettes, then actually this debate around whether it will actually help people quit is just holding up the process, basically. So now for conclusions, because I know we are short for time. So all of this is not to say that evidence of the effectiveness of a regulation is the only thing that matters. We all know that. Evidence is necessary, but not sufficient. Evidence tells us the likelihood that any kind of policy goal is likely to be achieved, but not whether that goal is worthy in the first place. Libertarians need to keep questioning these regulations that impede our freedoms and personal choice. Regulations also need to be justified on a cost-benefit basis. There are some regulations out there that actually could be quite successful, but are extremely expensive for the individual or government. But in the meantime, let's not let public health experts dominate the debate. At the moment, I fear that they're appearing more credible than they actually are, because there's no one who's actually calling them out for some terrible work. So the next time you hear about a study that doesn't sound quite right, or even one that does but is calling for a strong regulatory response, I highly recommend you just track it down. It's amazing what you can discover and what other people just miss because they're only relying on the media reports. And this sounds really terrible, I'm not actually attacking public health experts. Health experts are experts in their field. They're very talented, but their policy conclusions are often lacking. So that's pretty much me. If you do have questions, and I don't know whether I pitched this at the right level, I do have a bit more detail and a bit more knowledge on the subject if you are interested, so contact me on the address above or just come chat at lunch. But I look forward to the rest of the speakers now.